All right, I think I got it up. Can you guys see the slides?
Yep.
We can.
Woo! All right, great. Okay, let's do slideshow. Welcome to Wpack. Sorry for the problems. I'd used this before on this machine and I have no idea what happened. So in any event, we're actually a working group, so that's great. Thank you very much. My name's Sean. My other co-chair is?
Oh, hi, David Lawrence.
David Lawrence. So I'm going to run the slides today off my laptop. Dave's going to manage the queue, as he mentioned. Let's get into it. So this is the meeting tips, which you've probably been staring at for the last 10 minutes while I futzed around with my laptop. Please make sure your video is off. Mute your microphone unless you're speaking. Use your headsets to avoid echo. Please use the WebEx chat only to join the mic queue. Please add your name to the virtual blue sheets and join the Jabber for other various back channel discussions. Here's the note well. Please make sure you understand that we are recording this. Let's be kind and courteous to everybody. Hopefully you've seen a couple of these because you've been dialing into other sessions. Here's the requests. We got Ted volunteered to do the Jabber session, but we don't have a minute taker, or did I miss that?
Nobody has yet volunteered for a minute.
All right, so now we have the pause while we wait for someone to volunteer. I would love to be able to see the list of people, but unfortunately I'm full screen. Does anyone want to volunteer?
Jabber PWU said yes.
Yeah.
Great, thanks.
PWU is, oh, Peter Wu. Okay, thank you, Peter.
All right, great. So again, the other thing is that we need to do is when at the microphone or when you come off mute, please make sure to state your name. And let's keep it professional. So here's our agenda. Basically, we put this together. We weren't quite a working group, so we were going to do administrivia and then do some use cases and then jump into the protocol. The chairs actually think that we could maybe agenda bash the use cases out of this now, because basically we were just going to read the charter. So we're not sure that we really need this, and maybe we could give this 5 minutes back, considering that I ate 10 minutes trying to futz around with my laptop. Are there any objections to that? All right, great. So I guess what we're going to do is we're going to jump right into the web bundle. And let me see if I can find that. There it is. All right, Jeffrey, let me know when you need me to.
I will say next slide when I need the next slide. And that confirms that you can hear me. Okay, so I'm Jeffrey Askin. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the chairs for volunteering to chair. This is kind of a description of the work that we've done and the design sketch that we have in this bundled exchanges draft. None of this is final. I'll describe at the end what Chrome has implemented so far, but treat that as a prototype, as a way to gather evidence rather than kind of solidifying what has to happen. Okay, go to the next slide. So the general semantics of a bundle are that it's a sequence of bytes or a file that might be retrieved from a URL, might be stored on local disk, kind of whatever. It contains a set, which sometimes I've been thinking of as a cache of HTTP-like resources. Each resource, like an HTTP, is addressed by a URL, and there's some support in the format for content negotiation. Right now, expressed with Mark Nottingham's variance headers, but that has changed at least once in the evolution of the format and could change again to select a representation. There's also some bundle-wide metadata. The bundle starts with the URL of a primary resource which is used by a client. If someone navigates to the bundle, they actually load that primary resource. If the client can't parse the whole bundle, it can redirect to that resource. So that's kind of the required bit of metadata. And then there's another field where you can stick the URL of an internal resource that's something like a web app manifest or the EPUB package document or some other manifest-like metadata format that can allow the client to do something more intelligent with the contents of the bundle. Next slide. A resource inside a bundle is addressed by a full URL. So there's some authority inside that URL. The resource might be authoritative for the URL, and HTTP defines or uses this notion of an authoritative response. And there's several conditions that might cause the resource to be authoritative. The one that I think is pretty safe is if the bundle was retrieved from the same HTTPS origin. If you're familiar with service workers, you might have heard of a path restriction there. We should have the same path restriction here. Other ways of establishing authority we'll talk about. Super important for this presentation. Next slide. So now we have this kind of goal to have a format. There's a lot of formats out there. We need to make sure that we're not just kind of adding to the pile, that either we reuse an existing one or there's some compelling reason to design something new. And right now, I think there's compelling reasons to design something new, but we should always be kind of, as we refine the needs in this working group, we should always be paying attention to the possibility that will eliminate a requirement and that will allow us to reuse something. Next slide. So some of the properties of the current design. We're trying to make it secure. We're trying to make it extensible. We're trying to make it usable in a random access way and to load the content in a streaming way. And I'll describe what those mean in the next couple slides. So next slide. So we want to make the format secure, which means minimizing the probability of implementation errors. This isn't about kind of the cryptography involved. This is about kind of memory safety and ease of implementation. So for instance, zip allows implementations to read, to make at least two kinds of mistakes in picking what the name of a resource is. They can read it from the resource header instead of the global index, and they can pick the first instead of the last, or the last instead of the first copy of a name from that index, and that has caused security vulnerabilities. So we don't want to do that. We want to make the format easy to parse. Don't have a lot of kind of choices in the format, which would increase implementation complexity. I don't claim that the format kind of meets this goal perfectly, but it's kind of a design goal that we trade off, that we should trade off kind of changes in the format against. Next slide. The current format is extensible by adding new metadata sections. This is similar to a bunch of other formats like PNG and JFIF. And the current support for signatures are done as an extension section. They're kind of a side piece of the format rather than integrated into the whole thing. Next slide. So we want it to be random access. That is, we want to minimize the number of bytes that we have to read in order to pull out an arbitrary resource, instead of requiring that you always read a prefix of the format. Next slide. And we also want to be able to stream a load of the resource. So read as few bytes from the prefix as you can before you can start using the first resources within the bundle. The index that's in there to support random access compromises this goal some, but it seems to be acceptable so far, but we can certainly revisit it. Next slide. One property that we don't have is that is to allow a server to stream the generation of a bundle. And the charter also kind of doesn't or not explicitly, but intentionally skips this possible property. And in order to get it, we would have to get rid of at least one of the other properties. So there's several ways to do it, but we would have to sacrifice something. And if people want that, then we should talk about making one of these sacrifices and pick the sacrifice we want to make. So next slide. So one of the questions that we run into in using bundles is how do we name the contents of the bundle? So on this slide is a sketch of a URL scheme or URI scheme that might work. It includes both the URL of the bundle and the URL of the resource inside the bundle, structured in a way that the important parts wind up in what a web browser would parse as the origin. There's a question of whether we can use a package : / URL, or we have to use package : that I think we'll discuss more in the future. And then we want to assign a web origin to all of these resources. My initial thought had been to assign the origin as the URL. It's also possible to do an origin based on the content of the resource. And it's important to avoid having to hash the whole thing. So we probably would use something like Martin Thompson's Merkle integrity hash system. But again, that's something that we can work out in the future. The critical thing is that we need a way to address the contents and a web origin for those contents. Let's see, next slide. So these are partially implemented for some use cases in Chromium. It's currently possible to navigate to a bundle, and there's a web.dev article describing how you do that and giving some demos. We're working on being able to load sub-resources from a bundle. So this is things like provide all of the images on a page in one download, or provide a JavaScript module tree in one file. This is intended as a possible output format for things like Wpack and Parcel.js. And so we're prototyping that and measuring what the effect is. And we'd love to get more input on kind of what you want us to test, and kind of help with trying this out and figuring out what works and what doesn't work. Next slide. So there's a bunch of questions. This is probably not all of them. One piece of skepticism we've gotten is within a bundle, do we actually need things to be named by full URLs, or can we name them by just paths? Do we actually need content negotiation inside a bundle, or could we use just a URL and then a response and assume that the representation at a URL is unique? Should we separate the streamable format from the random access format? So if we have either two different formats or two options within the format, it can let us be a little more optimal for both at the cost of implementation complexity. And the question is whether that's worth it. And then the URLs and origins for the resources still need a lot of design, and people who know about URLs, it would be nice to tell us whether we've done it right or whether there's a better way to do it. I don't think we're trying to come to any firm conclusions at this meeting. This is just kind of things to start talking about, looking for stuff to pay attention to, and looking for people to help draft kind of the answers to these questions. So that's the last slide for this. We should talk.
Eric Griscorla, please.
Hey, Jeffrey. You said something about random access. I'm trying to figure out what the desirable random access properties you have are. namely, so I heard you say that you should be able to, access a subsection without having to like skim through the entire, the entire bundle, or at least on average half the bundle. And I thought I heard you say something about being able to use pieces of subsections without reading the entire subsection. Did I hear you correctly?
Let's see. So there's,
like say, got a bundle, like there's an image halfway through, right? And I want to get rid of the image, right? Or what point do you think I should be able to use the image?
Right. So the design so far has been that you should be able to go straight to an image. And then you should have to read the prefix of the image to start using it. And if these things have some sort of integrity attached, I've been using Martin Thompson's Merkle integrity to allow you to read just the first chunk before you start using it. If there's no integrity and no signature, you can probably just read the first bytes and use that. I have not been trying to let you read kind of the last half and then use just that last half. There are potentially some use cases around video and kind of very large resources that might benefit from that. But what I've heard from people who do video is that they're already used to chopping up the videos into small files, and so it's not actually a requirement for that use case.
Yeah, okay. I actually don't see the, I mean, I agree that Merkle tree is pretty much the way you have to do the individual pieces, but I don't actually see that in your spec. Is that just missing, or am I just like not reading very carefully?
So the only time you actually use the Merkle trees is when you're checking the integrity or authenticity of this thing. And so that shows up in the signatures section, but not in the fundamental bundles bundling work.
Oh, okay. I'll skim through it, but I understand what you're trying to accomplish. I think the important thing is that we should probably get some consensus on whether it's important to be able to start processing subcomponents before we get the entire subcomponent. That's probably something we should, because that adds substantial additional complexity, so we should decide if we think it's valuable or not.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, it seems to be valuable for, at the very least, HTML resources. So I'm lobbying for considering it valuable, but I'm happy to get more feedback on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, otherwise you have to just quarantine off the thing for side effects.
Yeah.
Murray, please.
Hey, just real quick, can you expand a bit on what that second bullet means? I'm still coming up to speed here a little bit, and that's the only one that stood out to me is,
Right. So you could have several different representations at one URL using, I'm using the HTTP terminology, which is not universal. So that is, if you have both like an image and a HTML page at the same URL, that you use the accept header to pick between. Or if you have two different languages at the same URL, that you use accept language to pick between, or gzip and bz2 or whatever. Do we want to support that, or do we want to force people who produce bundles to just assign different URLs to the different kinds of resources or representations at a single URL?
okay, thanks. It was terminology then.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. That was the end of the mic queue.
So from a chair's perspective, understanding this is the early days of the working group, what we're looking at trying to figure out with this draft is whether this is kind of a good starting spot for the working group to begin its work. So we're not going to do that call immediately, but that's how people should be thinking about looking at this draft, because there's not something that really else is coming along that's essentially like where we're trying to pick between the two. So in the coming weeks and months, I guess, people should think about whether this is a draft where we want to start from. All right, now here's here.
Hang on, Martin has some final comments. Martin, talk.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things here that Jeffrey covered that I'm not certain fit within the spec, or we might have to make some decisions about whether it fits within the spec.
Oh, absolutely. That's
as it's currently framed. I don't know that we really have enough time here to talk about whether it's appropriate to have some concept of URIs or identification for these things integrated. We obviously just had a discussion about how integrity interacts with this sort of thing. That too, I think, is an important discussion to have, but it may be a separate thing. Who knows?
Oh, no, Martin, I absolutely agree. I think what we have is this draft, and how we would carve it up and what parts stay and what parts don't is the discussion we're going to have in the coming weeks and months.
Right.
All right, I'm going to switch over here.
Sorry, I think I'm back in the queue. As
Okay.
I was hoping I was. Eric Scroll again. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a conceptual sort of question here, which is what the relationship is of the stuff in the bundle to stuff outside the bundle. And I think that partly dictates, Martin's question about like the URLs and partly other things. So like hypothetically speaking, so as a concrete example, you could say, well, I've got like a web page, and then it's got a bunch of like, and like, so the one classic way to build an app, right, is you've got like a giant like tarball of like supporting garbage, and then you have like a master web page which loads it up. And often, like if you're like using Django or something, then you like pull in, like interpolate JavaScript, interpolate values into the master web page. That has to be like online generated, but everything else can be static, right? And so one like super important question is like, does stuff in the bundle enter the cache and then get referenced by references in that generated thing? And I think that's probably the use case function that force factors how you reason about like some of the questions Martin was raising. Should we think of this as like, oh, this is like a thing, like a book, and it doesn't have it's like self-contained, or should we think of this as a thing that is like, is like kind of like more like HTTP push, right?
Right, Jeffrey, did you want to address that? I see you added yourself to the queue.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if I was like standing at the front of the room or in the mic queue.
You're still basically at the front of the room. You can address the.
Yeah. So my goal has been to make it possible that you take the stuff in a bundle and you kind of trust it as coming from the authoritative server. And for things at the same path, or things under the same path, that seems pretty safe. But it is something that we'll have to come to consensus on whether we actually want to do it. For a lot of the pure bundling use cases, I think it is useful to stick it in the cache and treat it and let it interact with stuff outside the bundle.
Okay, Yoav Whitespace.
Yeah, so I think that it's basically essential for some of the use cases to be able to interact with the resources that are in the bundle outside of it. I'm mostly thinking about the rollup / Wpack use case, where we would be able to bundle different JavaScript resources instead of what's currently being done by tools, turning them into one big JavaScript chunk. So in order for us to get benefits from that use of web bundles, I think we would need to have them be addressable outside of the bundle.
Jeffrey, any comments on that? I think we'll wrap up this and move on to the next presentation, unless you want to respond.
Nope, that matches my beliefs.
Okay. So Sean is bringing up the next.
Yeah, so we've had a little bit of discussion on the list for a counter proposal to the signed exchanges draft, and this is kind of a reframing of what the signed exchanges draft does in the context of bundles and in the context of what pieces are contentious. So this is a way of establishing authority for a resource inside a bundle that is based on signatures. So let's go to the next slide. So two of the goals that we established for in the charter were that we should be able to establish kind of a user level authenticity of content, and that users should have a continuous experience between things they got offline and things that they do online. So let's go to the next slide. So authenticity, is the way that I'm talking about it, is that the user gets a piece of content while they're offline. They might get it from their friend, they might get it maybe from a web server that's closer to them or that they've already been interacting with, rather than going directly to the origin. And they need to know where the content came from in a way that they understand. They need to know whether they can trust the content. And there's a caveat here. There was a presentation at EnigmaConf last year that URLs are not actually good at expressing authenticity to users. Users don't really understand what a URL means. But they're what we have, and we're fixing them for the online case. So providing them for the offline case would at least get that to parity with what we're doing while online. Next slide, please. The continuity of experience is about a user who gets a piece of content while they're offline. They use it some, they save some local state. Maybe they compose an email in this email application they got offline, or they draw a picture or whatever. And then they go online and they want to be able to send bits of that state over the internet, which means that the state needs to be accessible to the online version of the app. And then they go back offline and they get a new version. And then they want to keep editing the content that they created using this new version. And then they go back online and they want to send it to the online origin again, and so on. And so having a, sorry, go to the next slide then. So the solution that I've been proposing is to have someone sign the content with some private key, have existing certificate authorities check that the person who owns that private key is the same one who owns a particular domain, and then give the thing they signed an origin of that domain. So give them, if you know how to sign things as a domain, then your content can be trusted as that domain. Next slide. So this has a bunch of downsides in addition to the upsides. It allows off-path attackers. It means that users might continue using content that the author would like to have revoked. There's a pile of security considerations in the draft. There's a logistical problem with then updating the signatures. So next slide. So normally, an attacker who gets a TLS private key that they shouldn't have still has some logistical challenges in actually attacking people with it. They have to intercept the user's DNS request or somehow get on the path between the user and the actual site. If you get a signed exchange private key, you avoid all of those challenges. You can just attack people. Next slide. Content that is out of date or that is buggy in some way can still be used. So a signature proves that the signer vouched for it at some point. A TLS proves that they're vouching for it now. We limit signatures to 7 days, to a maximum of 7 days, to partially avoid this problem, but it's not complete, and it also introduces a whole pile of other problems, one of which I will talk about on the next slide. So that 7-day limit means that you have to re-sign content about every 3 days. That gives the distributor 3 days or so to pass it on to users and allows users to have about a day of clock skew, which is distressingly common. and then there needs to be some structure for clients to grab updated signatures so that they can send it to their peers within that couple day time frame. And we'd really like to be able to avoid that somehow. So we've got this kind of relatively simple to think about system in which kind of if you sign something, then it can act as you. And there's this pile of downsides. And so I want to take questions on the next slide about kind of any details of this, but then Martin's going to talk about a counter proposal that I think is complementary in a lot of ways. And so we can then talk about the trade-offs after his presentation. So yeah, any questions?
No, the mic queue has been clear. So now's your chance, though. Last call before we move on to the next. Okay, Martin, it looks like you're up.
So I apologize for not being able to keep up with the Jabber chat and Jeffrey at the same time, so I may have missed something there. There's a bunch of questions here that I think are really important, and I probably should have had some comments on that last one. But anyway, this is, I guess, an alternative reframing of the problem space. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a bit of a review, the current web security model depends on TLS connections. We have these things called service workers that aim to support the transition from an online state to an offline state. Often that's just a periodic thing. So people use them to deal with temporary glitches in connectivity. There's not a lot of sites that use this capability. We see that web service workers use for push messaging and not a lot else. The premise there is that you have some sort of online connectivity with an origin before you have any ability to go offline. But there are emerging drivers now for real offline solutions. So we have a ton of people who aren't online much, and that's much of the world, unfortunately. And there's also this interest in new content delivery methods. And here we're talking about things like AMP and whatnot. Next, please. So the basic problem is that we want to enable content to arrive by some method other than a TLS connection to the origin. And we want to make that content usable from that point without having gone online. And well, there goes Sean. If at some point that person comes online again in the future, then we want the content to be more usable. I mean, obviously, if you're offline, there's a bunch of things you cannot do, and it would be nice if those things were then available using all of the context that you might have built up while you were offline. So think about that in terms of, I've got an email client, and I can compose some emails to send to people that then get sent when I return online. Next page. So the basic problem here that we're dealing with is that stuff that you do while offline will accumulate state. And that state is what we're going to be talking about here as being important. The web's for communications primarily, and we have to assume that if we're using the web, and these things are web applications or websites, when we're using them offline, it means that we want to come and do some communication at some later point. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have essentially this be an application delivery platform with no future possibility of online communication. We already have plenty of alternatives in that space. So when we talk about the possibility of future communication, we have to consider what the effects of actions with that bundle are while you're offline, have on the later online state. So next page. So as Jeffrey talked about, the authority question is kind of key to this. If someone can't connect, how do we connect this online notion of authority to the notion that we have here of offline something or other? Jeffrey talked about using signatures. I don't know that that's entirely necessary, but it certainly has some value. And I'll probably get back to the point about the difference between what we tell people the origin is and what we tell, what we consider the authority to be. And that's something that we're just working through now on the list, I think. Next page. So obviously there's a bunch of things that we absolutely lose during the offline transition. Jeffrey talked about a bunch of other things that are a little less obvious that we lose as a consequence of having a design like this. And one of those things might be the, yeah, I'm really sorry about the phone thing. And now Joe, thank you. You've lost me. And so things like constructing the bundle has to be done in such a way as you lose certain personalization properties, because bundles will be potentially shipped to multiple people. And having personal information in bundles is something that we have to be careful to avoid. And obviously, while you're offline, you can't do things like communicate with other people and talk to servers, that sort of thing. There's a bunch of other questions about how much we can afford to sacrifice. Jeffrey talked about what it is that we display in the page in terms of origin. And there's a bunch of really hard questions there that need some consideration. So next page, I think I might skip over this a little bit. This is essentially my one-page summary of the signed exchanges thing. You take a bunch of stuff, you sign it, and then it becomes part of a real online origin. There's a bunch of problems with that potentially, but that's where it's at. Next slide goes through some of these. It's hard to know what's safe to sign. We have potential diversification of the way in which we determine what authority means. And Jeffrey talked about this a little bit as well. Because we diversify it, we potentially weaken what it means to have authority, and there's a bunch of things that you have to do in order to work through that. The revocation status and so forth is quite challenging. One of the major problems I identified there was that content has this limited lifetime. I think we're talking about 7 days, which actually in practice turns into quite a usability problem, in the sense that you can't have offline content that's good for very long because of things like clock skew and various other padding. You only have a couple of days worth of usage. There's a bunch of other minor things that go along with that as well. But anyway, to the proposal. Next slide. So the idea is to give content its own origin, distinct from the online origin that it might aspire to be part of, and distinct from the origin that may have delivered that content. The bundles have to identify the target origin. There's a bunch of reasons why you might want to do that sort of thing. And at the time when you come online again, or you decide to come online, because some of these things are discretionary rather than simply a consequence of not having an internet connection, you ask the target origin whether it wants to accept the content, and it can reject that, which is an important thing. Next slide, please. So this is obviously very drafty and sketchy, but you would say give a bundle a new type of origin. I used the named information URI scheme here because that was already available, but obviously there's a bunch of other ways we could slice this up. But here we have a different type of origin, and browsers know how to deal with origins, so we can treat this like any other origin. The content could even make HTTP requests, although if you are truly offline, then that's unlikely to work. And you can associate state with all of these things and whatnot. So you can access all of the standard APIs with these things. Okay, next please. So in designating a target, the bundle identifies where it wants its information to go, and it then initiates a transfer to that URL. And so the browser fetches that URL, asks that URL, essentially issues a challenge. And if the site answers the challenge correctly, then the site navigates to that online origin, but takes along with it all of the state and all of the content that was contained in the bundle. So anything that's been built up over time would go along with that transition. So if you had composed an email to send, that email would then be available to send. And the online origin or the target origin can actually send the email for you because now you're online. Next, please. So the draft has this concept of aliasing origins because we now have potentially multiple bundles that are in play. This, I think, sort of emerged organically from the design. I don't know that this is something that I'm committed to, but it seemed like a neat way to solve some of the problems. Essentially, when you have a transfer from the offline thing to the online thing, the origin that you had previously now becomes an alias for the thing that was it was transferring information to. And so that allows you to do things like, well, if people were previously talking to the offline origin, then those messages will be seamlessly routed to the online version of the same. I don't know if this is absolutely necessary, but it seemed convenient. Yes, next page, please. So there are two ways in which you might fail to transition. If you fail a transfer, that is because you're offline, or the server gives you a server failure error or something along those lines, then the content and all the state associated with it just sort of remains in the offline origin that you had in the content. But if the server fails the challenge and returns a positive response to your request, but doesn't provide you with a clear indication that it understands the request that you made of it, then what happens is that all of the state that you might want to transfer doesn't transfer, and you just navigate to the target URL and lose any of that continuity. And that allows the server to reject the things that were present in the bundle. So let's say you had a situation where the bundle had some JavaScript that turned out to have a cross-site request forgery bug in there. You discover that. The server can in the future then say, I don't want to accept that content. And by rejecting that, it doesn't expose itself to any of the problems that script might have caused. Problems that an attacker might have exploited as a result of that. Next page, please. So there's a bunch of limitations here. I think we're going to talk through some of the more difficult ones. Probably the more interesting one is that content isn't really attributed to an origin that people understand. That is only a potential the target origin is potential only, and that means that you can't do things like show that target in the URL bar. You can't say that this is a particular website, example.com. You have some sort of opaque gibberish that you want to show someone, which doesn't really work from a usability perspective. The transition to online takes a round trip. If you look at the signed exchanges proposal, one of the advantages, I guess, is that in particularly the AMP use case, you have a distributor can take a bundle of content, give that to you, you render it all up, and they say go, and the transition to something that looks to be online is virtually immediate. There's no back and forth to the server, whereas this requires that you go back to the server. The state transfer stuff is kind of non-trivial, particularly when you consider the possibility for a particular target origin to have multiple bundles outstanding. So you have a bundle for every news article on a site, and if every single one of them had state accumulated with that, merging all of that information is quite challenging. And there's probably a bunch of other things that I haven't thought of, and there's a few other things in the draft. Next slide, please. So just to go through the AMP case in a little bit more detail, you can imagine that, sorry, let's back up a little bit. AMP works by you visit a distributed page, they have a link or a bunch of links to content from other sites, but they don't want those other sites to be communicated with. They essentially tell the browser not to communicate with those sites, but they provide them with a bundle of content that is for those sites. The browser can then do things like pre-rendering that content and building it up. And if you look at the way that the content origins work actually proposes this work, is those things would operate in an offline origin by choice for the purposes of preparing that content for display. But this is a very short period of time, because once someone clicks on the link and follows into that offline origin, the transfer to an online origin would then be effectively immediate. So the state accumulation problem isn't so much of a big deal in this case. We only have to worry about the transition to being in an online origin. So there might be one round trip time while you talk to the server and check things, but it would immediately then flip across to the target origin. So in a sense, this case is much easier to handle than having a fully offline experience, but there are a bunch of usability problems to go along with that one. I think that's all the slides I had. If we go to the next one, we have a nice pattern, and that's all. And I think we'll open the floor to questions. Yeah, don't worry about that slide. We'll get into that later.
Okay, Larry Massenter, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We hear you.
Good. I'm interested in some other use cases, like take the example of PDF. You get a package of things that are intended for rendering. Of course, it has a paged imaging model, which is inappropriate for the web. But otherwise, you could take some clue from a PDF file. When you send it to someone, you are the person, maybe you gathered the information from a web page, and you want it to be laid out dynamically at the client, at the recipient side. But what you're signing is when you sign a PDF file, you're signing the presentation of the package rather than some individual transaction. And so I think that carries over into this use case.
Yeah, I don't see PDF as being needing any particularly special mechanism, but it's an interesting.
No, I'm saying that it has the use case that is currently for PDF of taking a web page and archiving it, or taking a web page and signing it as their final version, and that would be an interesting kind of replacement.
Thanks, Larry.
And the other thing is that if people do this with data colon URLs. They have data that they want to be part of the package, and I'd like to see this as explicitly the goal to obsolete, and just to think through what is the origin of a data. It should be the same as the origin of the original content in which it's embedded.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not up to speed on how those are handled in the web, but I think that's worth looking into. Thanks.
And then two other use cases that I'm not sure are as quite as strong. Well, multi-part related for MHTML and multi-part form data for file uploads. There are other instances of packaging that you want packaging to be, whatever Wpack does, should be able to obsolete those. Anyway, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Mark Nottingham, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
We hear you.
One round trip, okay. So in my incredibly simplistic brain, I think of web packaging as, okay, you package something up and you hand it to someone and you extend its lifetime where it can be used by signing it, and you get 7 days, and then you can extend that by more time later on, up to 7 days. And this one, I hand you something and it is magically given a separate identity in that transfer, where it's hash based. And then if I want to associate it back with the origin, it's again, I do some magic and then I can flip it over and it's part of that origin. And I think that's at a very, very high level about right. And I guess what's interesting to me about all of this is that both of these kind of feel like something which I'm more familiar with, which is web caching. And in web caching, I can still use a resource even if I'm not immediately connected to something because I've done it before and I had an explicit cache lifetime. Now, I can't handle my cache contents to you, Martin, and you then be able to use them as if it came from the origin, but I'm still using it without a direct connection to the origin, and that's authenticated by TLS. And so the observation that I guess I'm getting to is that in the caching world, one thing we've found is that choosing a TTL is really hard, and people get it wrong a lot, and it has a lot of effects on how not only performance but availability and a lot of other things. And that's at the granularity of a single resource. And both of these solutions do it at the granularity of a whole bundle of resources. So I'm just experiencing fear. That's all.
This is the fear of the work of the working group, I'm afraid, Mark. Yes, I share that fear.
So comforting hugs all around, and Ben Schwartz.
Hi, this is Ben Schwartz. I wanted to first say that a lot of the security problems you're talking about at least sound like they are solved by a distributor whitelisting of some sort. That is, if you're worried about things like the stolen key attacks, if you can make a long-term delegation or trust assertion to a distributor, that might help solve that. The other comment I'll make is, it seems like it might be possible to do this state transfer as a cross-origin post to the target origin and essentially handle the rest of the state transfer entirely in application logic. And if you don't want to actually post all of the state across the wire, maybe the target origin can have a service worker that takes it locally.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion, Ben. I did seriously contemplate that approach, but one of the things that's come out in the discussions is that there's a lot of cases where you can just do things like take an IndexedDB database and drop it across, and you don't have to put special code in the origin to handle that case. I was using database X. I continue to use database X after the transfer. That's fine. I know that no other bundles or no other resources on this origin will be mucking with that content. So this is safe for me to do. It gets a little more interesting when you have multiple potential bundles interacting with the same database, which is why the transfer exists. But yes, it does have some complexities involved.
Glad you got your mic working, Ben. On to Watson Ladd, please.
Hello, Watson Ladd from Cloudflare. So I think you really can punt on the state issue somewhat. If you provide the mechanism to get the state and know what bundle made it, then the application developer can decide, is this too old to merge, or is it still mergeable, either server side or client side, depending on how they're doing that already. The other thing is, with terms of layering, I think you really want this. Because if you have a web application where you have some JavaScript that's really setting everything up, and then you have another layer of JavaScript and CSS that's display, then a change to the display shouldn't, you probably don't want that to affect the validity of data stored in the lower layer. So I think if just for making sort of cosmetic changes, you really would like layering to be easy.
Right. Thanks, Watson.
Yoav Weiss, please.
Just a question regarding so since the origin is hash-based, does that mean we have to process the entire bundle before we know what the origin is?
Right. So that's a good question, Yoav. One of the things that I'd imagine doing here was using the progressive hash-based stuff that Jeffrey and I have been working on. He says it's my work. I say that he's allowed to claim that as well, which essentially says that you can use the advertised hash of the content prior to actually knowing the whole content and receiving the entire bundle. Obviously, you need to validate that, but you could potentially do that as well.
Okay, thanks.
And then Eric Criscorla, please.
Howdy. Martin, I guess I admire the purity of this proposal. I think offline I emailed you a sort of hybrid proposal that's where things are named not by content hashes but by signature keys. I think that has some of the properties of each of these proposals. In particular, it allows you to upgrade the to maintain state across packages as they're upgraded. But then it has some of the same compromised properties, unfortunately compromised process properties that signing has. So I think it's great to have these two examples on either side of it, but I just wanted to float that there's an intermediate example that has linear combination of the two properties that one might imagine thinking was good or might not.
Yep. So I think we're going to get into that in the next
oh, great.
discussion as well.
I didn't see it in Jeffrey's slides, but maybe I just missed it.
Yep. It has always been my intent to sort of show this as the extreme position, and I just didn't have time to write up the alternative. But I obviously think that some of the properties of the signing side of this is quite interesting.
Certainly not going to blame you. I was too lazy to write it up myself.
Ed Hardy, please.
So Ed Hardy, peer-to-peer enthusiast. So I really like some of what this is doing. As I put into the chat, I think there are definitely cases here where this could be useful either in the presence of signatures, like the signed bundles as they are now, or to move from kind of a context where you have something which is not signed and be able to treat it as signed, and kind of joining those two contexts would be quite useful. I don't think I see the trade-off this is making and that we discussed on the list as eliminating the need for signed bundles. I think we have in our charter the ability to receive a web package from an entity other than the origin server and have continuity of experience in state as kind of a key goal here. And for me, that's always meant that you be able to do this in a way where that continuity of state merges with state that's already there. And I think we kind of motivated that on the list. Ben did with a simple example, and I did with a much more dire one. But I'm really interested to hear whether you're willing to pursue this, even if we also continue to go forward with signed exchanges, because I personally think that would be useful. But it's not clear to me whether you think this is a pure alternative or just another contribution to the set of possible outcomes.
I don't think this is necessarily exclusively an alternative to what Jeffrey has proposed. I think this is just eliminating some of the other opportunities that we have for things in this space. I'm going to have to come back to that discussion we had on the list. I think there are some interesting pitfalls that creates, that taking an approach that's more toward this end of the space might avoid. So I think there's probably a bunch more iteration we have to do on the discussion there. I'm particularly interested in the question of how we take attribution and continuity and think about those things, but perhaps as separate concepts.
I really appreciate your willingness to engage in that iteration, and I agree with you that that's going to be a key piece to this. The way I think about this, and there are 107 people on the WebEx, so certainly somebody hasn't heard me natter about this in the past, is that with this system in place, you get the consequence that the web can continue when the internet is withdrawn. And that's something that, the references to the other bundle project and DTNs aside, is a really interesting thing for those of us who care a lot about peer-to-peer use cases. And in particular, given that the possibility that the internet is withdrawn and in consequence of something outside the user's control, not just they didn't turn on their their network. So I would really like us to distinguish between cases where that maybe isn't the primary goal, but is still something we can support with a little bit more work, and cases where for some security or other trade-off, we simply can't support it at all. And I appreciate your willingness to iterate on that.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting space to be working in. One of the reasons why I hadn't thought so much about the internet is withdrawn being something that this working group was interested in, is that we sort of have a self-service option for that one in service workers. I'm not sure that I'm especially happy with that solution, and adoption of that particular capability sort of indicates that other people aren't either. So I'm certainly willing to talk about it.
Okay, just a quick note that we only have 16 minutes left in this session and still one more 10-minute presentation from Martin and Jeffrey. And then we had 50 minutes of discussion at the end, but we're not going to have that full amount of time. Devin and DKG, DKG just took himself out of the queue. But Devin, if you could please make it kind of quick so that we can get Jeffrey and Martin's last prezo in.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me? This is Devin Mullins. I just want to add two nuances. One is the AMP is the concept that AMP is sort of offline by choice for a little bit is mostly true, but I guess it's for resources that don't require the authoritative origin, they could kind of erase the state transfer request. And the other one of the comment is that the comment that like, because the index DB migration, if the database X doesn't exist in the authoritative space, that it would be safe to just drop it there. I don't think that would be true for arbitrary content. There is the potential that kind of databases X and Y could conflict in the JavaScript application, though I certainly don't know of any kind of specific cases of that.
Yeah, that's a good comment and something we'd have to work through, I suspect.
All right, so we're switching gears to to a comparison of the two. I guess we should really preface this to say that, as you can tell from the discussion, that the two proposals are working together, and so it's not necessarily true that we're going to have a beauty contest. I think we're actually trying to avoid that, and I guess I appreciate both the authors willing to work together. So I'm not sure how, Jeffrey and Martin, how you guys want to divvy this up, but you guys just want to tell me next slide and I'll do that.
Yeah, I think I'm going to do most of the talking here, but Martin is welcome to jump in and we'll both answer questions and stuff. So yeah, as Sean said, this is not kind of an either-or question. I think these are complementary approaches and that we will eventually wind up taking some pieces of each. So to recap, with a signer origin, the content gets its origin based on who signs it. With a content origin, it's based on the hash of its bytes, and then some online origin might adopt it later. Next slide. So there's some risks that are shared by both approaches. We don't want an online origin to adopt personalized content, including cookies. That can cause a set of problems that are described in the signed exchanges draft. And you have to bundle a set of resources together to avoid an attacker skewing the versions to break the site and get something that they shouldn't have. Next slide. So each approach is good at some things and compensates for some of the things the other approach doesn't do as well. Next slide. Signed origins don't handle liveness very well. They give you that up to 7-day window in which something might have been revoked. Whereas content origins, by getting a real-time vouch, they solve that problem. And so if we, instead of giving things a pure signer origin, maybe signatures could expire with a longer time frame to give kind of a human understandable notion of where something came from without letting attackers take advantage of it. Next slide. Upgrades are a problem for content origins. As I think Ecker pointed out, it's hard to say that the version I'm going to release next week should be able to be an upgrade for the version I released today, because you don't know the next week's version's hash. Whereas with a signature, you can say that I trust this signer to get my data, and then when it comes back online, we'll check with the liveness check I mentioned in the previous slide. So signatures are probably an important addition to the content origins. Next slide. Then we have the question of what URL to display. As Martin described, a content origin is not human readable. It's that NI garbage. And a signature from some human understandable signer gives you something to put in the URL bar. I believe Martin may have something to add here about some details of how we decide to trust things. It's not obvious that kind of a 7-day-old signature is definitely what you want to describe in the URL bar.
Yeah, so I think probably the most important thing here is that when we do something like a hash-based origin or an origin based on a signature key, as what Ecker suggested, is that's not human readable or usable in any way. But there's a distinction between the concept of the origin that the browser has in mind and separation of content, and the thing that is displayed to the user. And I think we can explore the separation of those states. One of the things that Firefox has had for a long time that's kind of unique in the browser world is this concept of extended attributes on origins, which allows us to segregate off content from ostensibly the same origin into different compartments, if you will. And so that's a powerful concept I think might inform some of the designs eventually.
Yeah. So next slide has a summary of this presentation and how I thought we might mix the two proposals. But let's open the floor to discussion.
Okay, actually, this will be our wrap-up discussion. We do have 10 minutes left in the session, and at the moment, only Eric is in the queue. Eric Escuela, please.
Howdy. So I think I understand the first two columns here, but would you mind walking through this slide?
Yeah, so to solve the problem of liveness, it'd be nice to use content origins for it. The reason I mentioned if content origins work is because the state transfer is complicated and we'll have to figure out how to design it. For upgrades, the signatures are key. So we need to do something that involves identifying a signer who is allowed to get the origins data. And then for URL display, I think that we'll want to show something based on the signer's origin in the URL bar. Did that make sense?
Well, I think I understood the first two. The first two made about lined up about what I was expecting. The last one, I think I'm a little confused on. So I mean, I think in my hypothetical world. So I guess like let's just try to walk through these, and feel free to tell me like anybody else gets on the line, I'll just shut up. But since we have 9 minutes, I mean, it seems to me that in signed exchanges, what happens? Thanks, DKG. I'll take about 2 minutes then. In signed exchanges, what happens is you always show like the origin of the signer, right? Right. And in I'm gonna pretend for the moment we're still showing URLs, even though I hear people want to remove them. In the content version, in the sort of intermediate stage, you know, kind of problem because you can like, you know, when it's not been adopted, you show some garbage, right? Or you show nothing or something. And when it's been adopted, you show the adopted thing, right? Are we on the same page there? Okay. Yes. So I think those are like the only possible, as far as I can tell, that's like the only possible way you could like implement like the content, you know, either of the sort of content, whether it's signing or non-signing content ones, and like why would you do anything else for the sign exchanges one? So I think those are the outcomes you get. Yeah.
I'm only talking about that intermediate state before you've contacted the origin. And the question is, what do you show there? And I think signed exchanges have something to offer in figuring out what to show in that intermediate state.
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Once we've checked online, then you should show the online version.
Right. I mean, otherwise, I think for those content recordings, you got like throw up your hands, right? One thing I think would be useful to have is Martin and I had a like extended exchange offline about this sort of you know, security compromise properties of this, which I'm not sure I've reasoned about that well. So if you guys have something that sort of like compares the sort of like effects of host compromise and key compromise, that'd be helpful. If not, maybe I'll do it.
We do not have anything like that yet.
Okay. Well, if someone posted a list before I do, then I won't do it. But otherwise, I'll probably take a crack at it because I think it'd be useful to think about because it's quite subtle, I think.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel Kahn-Gilmore.
This is Daniel Kahn-Gilmore. I am just the more I think about this, I keep finding weird corners of it, which I find really distressing. But I'm going to zoom way out and just. One of the use cases that was mentioned was like a email program, right? That you fetch as a bundle, you use it in an offline state, and when you reconnect, you're sending messages. And I'm just trying to think through what the user experience is there. In the liveness, so say I've composed an email and I'm going to go send it when I get back online. I get back online and I discover that it is no longer live. It's no longer fresh. What happened to my email that I composed?
The current sketch says you lose it. I think we'll be able to refine that to say that kind of the online origin gets some way to recover the state, but it's tricky because that state could be arbitrarily compromised, and so the online origin has to be careful not to be compromised by that state.
Yeah, that seems like a very delicate process. And then while I'm composing in this offline app, you tell me that instead of where I used to see you know, my email provider.biz, I'm now seeing the janky, incomprehensible, non-human readable content hash.
Martin, you want to take this one?
Yeah, so this is the hard thing. How many people actually look at what's up there? I don't know. Emily Stark had some research on this one that was kind of interesting.
Just to be clear, like the fact that that many people don't use security indicators doesn't mean we should throw away all security indicators. I mean, I'm a big fan of simplifying But to say you had this one handle and now you have 0 handles because most people didn't use the handle in the first place seems problematic. I'm not saying I need the full URL, but the origin at the very least is what people are, you know,
well, you need to
care about.
Yeah, so you need 2 things. I'm sorry you're breaking up, and it may just be me. But there's really 2 things here. One is the reputation that you attach to the content that you're interacting with, and the other one is understanding where it is the information you're putting in might end up going, and those may be separate things, but both of those are important in this context.
Okay. I'm liking some suggestions that are in the Jabber chat right now. They're making me feel a little bit better. One other wrinkle that I wanted to throw in is one of the major problems that we've had with DNSSEC, which is another signed records, signed content instead of authentication, is proof of non-existence. And we've talked about bundles and the items within the bundles themselves having URLs. And it's not clear to me if 2 different bundles could potentially contain resources that are actually the same URL as one another. And you know, the obvious question there when we're looking at upgrades is which one takes precedence. But then you have another question, which is, are we expecting to represent like 404s, for example, in this?
I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry. Worth taking up later. Thank you.
Mike Bishop, please.
This is Mike Bishop. I was just going to comment in terms of the origin display. I commented on Jabber. I think probably the most sensible and user understandable thing is to display that it's from the origin as of when it was signed or last validated. And if people are offline and you told them it's from 3 weeks ago, they're going to be okay with that because they know they're offline. I also think in terms of the transition to online state, I think it's not just a binary accept reject, but there's also needs to be a yes, that was mine, but it's old. So I would like your state and I would like you to load this other thing.
Thank you, Mike. Wendy Seltzer for the last comment, please.
Thanks, Wendy Seltzer here. And I was interested in the, thanks for these presentations, and I'm interested in the sort of tension between sort of control by the origin and signer and control by the user, and wondering sort of how far we're shifting away from the end user who wants to do something different from what the packager intended might be able to repurpose the archival use case or the anonymous passing on of content. Just a thought to wrap.
And a thought that's well appreciated. I'm not sure that we have any really good answer to it just yet.
Okay. Thank you. It's back to Sean for closing comments. We are at time though, so I will say thank you all for your participation, and Sean gets the last word.
Yeah, again, thank you for all of your time. Apologies again for me flubbing around with my laptop. I've installed the thing for the next time. Let's take it to the list, folks. Thanks a lot.
Bye all. See you at the plenary.
Thank you.